Greetings everyone. Today is our day 20 of PMP6 exam prep step by step. Today we'll be looking at, in fact, the last knowledge area, which is project stakeholder management. If you look at our process table, we can see that in our last session, we covered project procurement management, which had 3 processes. And today, we are moving to the next one, the last knowledge area in that particular list, which is project stakeholder management. If we look at it closely, we'll see that there are 4 processes in stakeholder management, and one each in initiating, planning, executing, and monitoring. We might also want to note that there is one process in initiating process group, which really means we start stakeholder management very early in the project management. Now, if we take a look at an overview of all the processes that are there in stakeholder management. First of all, stakeholder management is about identifying stakeholders. And who are the stakeholders? Stakeholders are those people or individual or group that might have an impact on the project, or those group or individual who will be affected by the project. So it is either way. There might be some stakeholders who are affecting us. For example, HR, who are providing resources. They might not really be concerned what is happening to our project, but we are getting affected because they are contributing with resources. And there might be others who we are actually directly impacting by our project. So that is stakeholders. What we are going to do in stakeholder management is identify who are our stakeholders and ensure that we are able to effectively engage them as we run the project. Now, if we look at the processes, the first process that we look at is identify stakeholders. Now, remember that this is in the initiating process group, and what we're going to do is we are going to look at different ways to identify the stakeholders. Stakeholders who could impact the project or who might be impacted by our project. Then we'll move to the next process, which is planned stakeholder management. And planned stakeholder management is really drawing a plan how we will keep the stakeholder engaged. In other words, we'll prepare a roadmap, an approach to involve stakeholders. And then once we have drawn the plan, we will go into the process which is manage stakeholder engagement, or in this particular process, what we are going to do is we work at keeping our stakeholders engaged as we run the project. And then finally, we look at monitor stakeholder engagement process, where we will monitor how our plan to engage stakeholders is going on as we run the project. And if there are any gaps, we would fill the gaps and improve the process. So essentially, we will be monitoring overall relationship that we have with our stakeholders. So these are the 4 processes that we will cover in this particular knowledge area, the stakeholder management. Now, stakeholder management is what can be said is key to project success. Now, really, if you think about a lot of projects, or the way it is handled is we have the same set of information sent to all the users who we think are the stakeholders. Now, in other words, we try cookie cutter approach. But what we are trying to do here in stakeholder management is to realize that each stakeholder or each stakeholder group is unique. Their requirements will be unique, and we have to engage them in an unique way. And so that is really the purpose of the stakeholder management. We should start the engagement at the earliest, because the earlier that you start the engagement with the stakeholder, you will you will have a better chance of success in the project. It is a continuous communication process. In other words, what you'll also see that there is a close correlation in the processes that we saw on activities that we saw in processes in the communication knowledge area, because stakeholder engagement will employ effective communication for your engagement purpose. And the stakeholder management has to be tailored to your project. Tailored to your project in terms of diversity. Look at what kind of cultural diversity there are in the project. And you might want to use that information to actually engage with the stakeholder. Be aware of the complexity. Complexity, for example, networking complexity. If your stakeholder is a member of many different networks, then there is an opportunity for information or disinformation. In such a case, is much more. So we have to be aware of the complexity, in other words, the network complexity of the stakeholder. And also communication technology. So we have to see what is the communication technology that will be best suited for our project, considering the stakeholders we are actually engaging and considering how we are, what kind of information we are providing to our stakeholders. In an agile and adaptive environment, we know that there has to be a very close interaction. And because it is a fast moving environment and it's a lot of changing environment, that's what we have seen, what is agile and adaptive environment. And so we have to understand what kind of changes that will happen in managing the stakeholders. So some of the things that we have to consider when we are working in an agile and adaptive environment is that we would try to have direct engagement with the stakeholders instead of going through layers of management. We need to basically establish direct engagement instead of going through layers of management. And we should promote what is called an aggressive transparency. It has to be transparent. The interaction will have to be transparent, and we have to aggressively promote that. Unless we do that, there will be issues with this kind of environment. And some of the way we will do that is by inviting our stakeholders to project meetings, reviews, so they come together, work with us or work with the project team, and in effectively co-create the project or co-create the solution in the project. With this as the background, let's move on and look at our first process, identify stakeholders. Now, identify stakeholders, if you look at it from a process perspective, we have inputs like project charter, business documents, project management plan. And then it will go, we'll use different tools, we'll look at, and then finally the main output that we'll get is the stakeholder register. Stakeholder register is the primary output. Of course, there will be others, but this is the primary output that we'll get out of the identify stakeholder process. Now, stakeholders, they are the people, they can be people, they can be group or organizations. This is what we are going to do in identifying stakeholders. We'll identify people's, groups, or organizations who may affect the project or be affected by the outcome of the project. Now, we have to remember that their interest of the stakeholders, the people, group, organization that we identify as the stakeholders, their interest in the project may be positively aligned or negatively aligned. When we say positively, they might be in support of what we are doing in the project. They might look at our success in the project. They might want the project to be successful. As opposed to that, stakeholders who are negatively aligned, they don't want it to succeed. They are unsupportive. And you will not get cooperation as long as they are negatively aligned. Stakeholders, again, may be internal or external to the organization. Internal meaning within the organization. External, for example, the government, who is outside the the organization. And it is important, as we are repeating again, because it is critical to understand that it is important to identify early in the project. We need to identify stakeholders very early in the project and right when we initiate the project. Now, when we do the stakeholder analysis, and we want to find, the stakeholders, identify the stakeholders, and we want to understand the stakeholders more so that we are able to effectively engage with them. And the things that we look at when we are doing a stakeholder analysis is the position in the organization, because each position will come with its own responsibility and roles and how you can expect them to interact with your project. And their roles on the project, basically when you say roles in the project, roles in relation to project in terms of how they're contributing or how they're interacting with the project and the project team. Then what are the expectations? Each stakeholders will have different expectations. First of all, if they're direct user, they just want that it has to come up, it has to provide what it is expected to provide in terms of functionality. Or if the senior management, or the management, they would want, their main focus would be that you are meeting the cost, or you are doing within the budget, you are doing within the schedule, and so on. And of course, how you are handling the resources and so on. So each stakeholder will have different expectation from the project. What are the attitudes? Like we said, some might be negatively aligned, some might be positively aligned, some might be champion for the project. So we need to understand that, as well as what are the stakes. When you say stakes, what are the interests in the project? What kind of interest do they have in the project? What are the rights? When you say rights, it can be legal rights, it can be moral rights. For example, legal rights, maybe the occupancy safety, and that might be a legal rights based on which country that they are in. They have the right or the legal right to be in a safe environment. Or moral rights, maybe they are looking at a sustainable, environmentally sustainable process. So that's the moral rights. So what are the rights? What are the ownership? Do they have a title to the asset? So this is what we are talking about in terms of the ownership of the stakeholder. Knowledge, they might have some specialist knowledge that will be helpful for our project, or they might be contributing, or what are the contributions? Maybe they are providing as a funds. For example, it is a sponsor, project sponsor, we will be look to them for the fund for funding the project. So all this different information we'll collect when we do stakeholder analysis, so that we can understand each of the stakeholder better, and we will be able to, which will help us to engage with them more effectively. Now, when we do the stakeholder analysis and we want to understand more about the stakeholders, and also what will be the interest, how will they interact with us with our project, one of the technique or tool that is very helpful is to look at the stakeholder classification. And we can use different tools in classifying stakeholders. So let's look at them. One is called grid analysis. In the grid analysis, there are different types of grid analysis. In this particular grid analysis, what you see is we are creating a grid with power as in the y-axis and interest in the x-axis. So it's a power interest grid, and we make 4 quadrants here in this particular grid, where in the interest we say low to high here on the x-axis, and in the y-axis we are saying low to high in the power. Now if you see this particular quadrant, which is with low interest and low power, so we have stakeholder C and stakeholder D. And because this grid or stakeholders in this quadrant have low power and low interest, or low power meaning ability to influence the project, and interest, low interest, what the strategy that we'll take is to just monitor them. Similarly, if you look at this particular quadrant to the top right, which have high power and high interest, our strategy will be to manage closely. And in this particular quadrant, which is high power and low interest, our strategy will be to keep them satisfied. And here, when it is high interest and low power, we will take a strategy probably to keep them informed. So when we look at a grid and we classify according to what is the power and what is the interest and put them in a grid, we can take a strategy, specific strategy, based on where they are placed in the grid. Similarly, we can look at it from the power influence. So again, we can look at what is the, where do they fit in each of these stakeholders in the grid, and we can take a similar approach in classifying. Then we can again take a, approach, or take a grid of influence and impact. So if we, for example, have a stakeholder who is having high impact and high influence, we have to manage them closely, as opposed to low impact and low influence who will just monitor. So through the grid analysis, we come across different quadrants, and based on the quadrants, we take an approach, we take a strategy, how we will be engaging with that group of stakeholders. Now, we can extend that through what is called as stakeholder cube. In the stakeholder cube, what we do is we take, for example, 3 of them instead of 2, where we saw in the grid. Here, for example, we might be taking 3 indicators, 3 factors. One is power, interest, and influence, and see where the stakeholder will fit in, and based on that, we can take up a strategy. For example, if someone has very high power, high interest, and high influence, then we will take and the approach that we take will be different from who has low power, low interest, and low influence. Then there is another model which is called salience model. So through the salience model, we try to understand how relevant these stakeholders are. And it is done through 3 aspects. We look at the 3 aspects. One is the power, so we look at that, and we create a Venn diagram, so to speak. And then we look at urgency. When we say urgency, how critical will their request be? Maybe because they are very closely engaged and they have they'll be affected. They have the effect on them, on what they do by the project, will be very high, and so they have a very urgent need. And so we look at what is the urgency of this particular stakeholder, and of course, and also the legitimacy, how appropriate their request is. And when we put them together, we can see where they fit in. For example, if you see number 7 here, where they have the power, it is urgent, they are legitimate, we should really give them the focus. As opposed to someone, let's say in 3, who doesn't have a lot of power, doesn't have legitimacy, but they're urgent, so we have to really look at what it is that they're looking at. So based on where they fit in the salience model, we understand how relevant they are, or how relevant the requests are, and we can spend or prioritize our approach accordingly. So we saw that there is for example, definitive, there are domains, so there are different types of what you call the need. And then we will also look at direction of influence. Each category of stakeholders, and the direction can be different, in the sense there are different types of stakeholders. And so where will their influence come into the project? So for example, there might be the upward influence, which is really, we are talking about senior management, their influence. So it is coming from up. So the direction of influence is upward. Yeah, as opposed to that, there can be downward influence, basically the team that you're working on, and so on. Then there can also be sideward influence, basically other project managers, your peers. So the influence from them is what is called the sideward influence. As well as there can be outward influence from entities outside the organization. Let's say government, let's say some establishment outside, or suppliers. So the influence from them is what we call the outward influence. So we need to understand that as well, because that will help us how we engage with that. As a result of all our analysis, we'll come out with a very important document, which is stakeholder register. And this will be really used throughout the project. In fact, if you have seen, we have talked about the stakeholder register even when we are making our communication plan. So in stakeholder register, there are a couple of pieces of information. One is the identification information, of course. And when we say identification information, we'll put in what is the name, what's the organizational position, where are they located, what is the role in the project, what is the contact information. And then we'll talk about assessment. We have done some assessment of the stakeholders. And as we do that, we will put down some assessment information. What is the major requirement? What are the major requirements? What is the main expectation? What are they looking at from the project? And what is the potential influence in the project? And areas and phases of the project having impact, because not all stakeholders will have an interest or impact at every phase of the project. Some will have more in one phase, less in another phase, and so on. So we would like to actually understand and document what are the areas and phase of the project that they are having impact. And then the classification that we did. Classification, are they internal or external? What is the impact? What is the influence, power, interest? And then is there influence upward, downward, sideward, outward, etc.? And so we will be putting together all this information in the stakeholder register. Now we have finished off with identify stakeholder. Now with that we will move into our next process, which is plan stakeholder management. Now plan stakeholder management, if you look at it as a process, we will look at the charter and project documents, and in the project documents, of course, one of the key input will be the stakeholder register, and then we'll use different tools, and the output that will come out with is a stakeholder engagement plan. Now, stakeholder engagement plan, once we make that is going to drive how we engage stakeholder throughout the project. Now, in plan stakeholder management, what we really do is we develop approaches to involve stakeholders. We put together a plan, put together a roadmap, how we will be involving stakeholders. And we have basically we look at the stakeholder needs, interest, and potential impact that we have also discussed. And all the approach will be based on what we find from analysis of our stakeholders. We'll put together how to maintain relationship between project team and stakeholders. Now let's look at stakeholder engagement levels. Now there are different levels where stakeholder is engaged or can be engaged. One is unaware. Now, when you look around for stakeholders and try to analyze, you will probably find some stakeholders who are really unaware of the project, the impact of the project. Even though they are your stakeholders, they don't know about the project, they are not even aware what impact they might have and what they might be able to contribute to the project. So that is unaware. Then there is that category or that level where we are saying they're resistant. Resistant in the sense, for whatever reason, maybe because the way they perceive that their work will get negatively impacted or their prospects will get negatively impacted, they might be resistant to the project. They might be resistant to the project. They are unsupportive. You might not be getting the cooperation from them, or essentially they don't want your project to succeed. So they are resistant stakeholders. Then there might be neutral. Another level is neutral. Neutral is when they really don't care. They don't care if you succeed, if you don't succeed, but they do know that the project is going on. They do know what is their role in the project with respect to the project. And then we have the supportive stakeholders. Supportive stakeholders are, they want you to succeed. They'll provide you whatever you ask for. They'll cooperate with you when you want some information. So they are supportive. And then finally, we have that category of stakeholders who we say leading. Leading means they actually will be your champion. They'll go around everywhere and say what good the project will be doing, and they will be your champion, not only supportive, but a level higher where they'll champion a project and or provide you, of course, all helps and all connection that is required for your project. So there are these 5 engagement levels. Now, these 5 engagement levels, how do we use them? Is just knowing that, well, these are different engagement levels, and each of the stakeholders, we are at different engagement level. It doesn't help us much unless we know how to apply that levels, right? So the way we do it is with what we call engagement assessment metrics. In engagement assessment metrics, what we find out is for each of the stakeholders, we try to determine what is the current state and what is the desired state. So for example, we take each of the stakeholder, let's say stakeholder 1, and we find from our analysis the stakeholder 1, the level of the engagement currently is unaware. But for our project purpose, we want that stakeholder 1 to be supportive. Again, for stakeholder 2, we find that stakeholder 2 is resistant, and we want the stakeholder 2 to be again supportive. Stakeholder 3 is also resistant, but we don't really need the stakeholder 3 to be supportive. It's enough if we can move the stakeholder C to neutral. Stakeholder 4 is leading, and we want to keep stakeholder 4 at leading. So what we are going to do here is, when we create that engagement matrix, and based on what is the current state and what is the desired state, we plan out how or what kind of communication we'll do to move that particular stakeholder, from the current state to the desired state. And this assessment matrix can help us understand what kind of how we should move the stakeholders based on where they are. And then based on this assessment matrix, we can draw a communication plan, and you can do different things. For example, if you are trying to move resistant to supportive, for example, in this stakeholder 2, and from your communication plan, you know that stakeholder 4 is leading and with supportive, you might be able to take help of stakeholder 4 to bring stakeholder 2 in your fold and make the stakeholder 2 understand what are the benefits of your project, and gradually move stakeholder 2 to from resistant to supportive. So again, this will help us, but at the same time, you can use some other information that you have drawn in some other processes to actually achieve what you really want to achieve, to move the stakeholder to the desired state. The outputs that we get out of stakeholder engagement plan is basically, first of all, we will come with current and desired engagement level of stakeholders that you have just seen, and then scope and impact of change to stakeholders. So what kind of change will go, what will be the impact of change to stakeholders, and what is the scope of change to the stakeholders? How will the stakeholders get affected? And what is the relationship? What is the relationship that is there? And also, you might want to capture what is the relationship between the stakeholders. For example, if stakeholder 2 and stakeholder 4 that we saw, one was a leading one, one was resistant, if they have a good relationship, stakeholders and stakeholder 4, then it will be much easier for us to move stakeholder 2 from resistant to supportive. So that relationship and potential overlap, and also what is the preferred communication requirements of each of the stakeholders. These are things that we really put together in the stakeholder engagement plan. Now we have finished this plan, and now we will take this forward in managing stakeholder engagement. As we move through the project, we want to engage stakeholders effectively, and we will do that based on the stakeholders that we identified, stakeholders we have analyzed, the analysis that we have done on stakeholders, and the plan that we have drawn. So when we look at this particular process, we will find that, well, there are some inputs, and there will be different plans and project documents, and we will look at some tools, couple of tools, and there might be some change requests that comes out from our experience as we are engaging with the stakeholders. So what we really do in this particular process, we engage stakeholders at appropriate stages. In other words, we now, with all the analysis that you've done, we will know which stakeholders will be influenced at what stage, and it is not necessarily the same. And so we will have drawn a plan that we can effectively use. And as a result, we will be managing stakeholder expectation. And if they have some concerns, they raise some concerns, we will be addressing their potential concerns. And we should also try to be proactive. Even before they raise their concern, if we can proactively anticipate and address that, that is the better way to go. And if there are issues that comes up when we're engaging stakeholder, we will clarify and resolve these issues and so on. Now, when we are engaging stakeholders, there are two things that come in play. One is communication, our communication skills. And in our communication skill, feedback is going to be very effective, because once we understand or we are able to get feedback from the stakeholders, we will be able to better meet their expectation. And that we'll do through conversation. When we have regular conversation, we will be able to get their feedback, address their issues, and when they raise their issues, we are getting a feedback. In meetings, we are getting a feedback. When we are reporting progress and they ask us questions and we probe with them, what are their insights, what are the feedback, what are the inputs, that is also going to give us a feedback. And oftentimes we can come up with surveys to get input and feedback from the stakeholders. So if there is any way our project is not aligned to their expectation, we can bring that on track. And of course, when you do that, we're engaging stakeholders, many of our interpersonal or team skills that will come in play. For example, conflict management or cultural awareness. We need to be aware because based on their cultural background, stakeholders can respond differently. We will, of course, go through a lot of negotiation as we discussed. We'll observe, we'll converse, we'll have we need to be politically aware what is going on, how is the power struggle playing out in the organization, and so on. So these are our interpersonal and team skills that we have, which we will employ when we are engaging stakeholders. So with this, we have finished with this particular process, engaging stakeholders, and then we move to or manage stakeholder engagement. Now we are moving into the next process, which is the last one, is monitor stakeholder engagement. Now, monitor stakeholder engagement, when you look at it as a process, again, we'll have different inputs as well as some tools that we'll use and outputs that we'll have is a work performance information change request. So the main monitor stakeholder engagement, again, like monitor, when you're talking about monitor, we are trying to ensure that we are moving ahead the way we planned. In other words, we are engaging stakeholders based on the plan that we have made. So essentially what we are trying to do is we are monitoring overall relationship with stakeholders. And when we are monitoring a stakeholder relationship, we are ensuring that we are engaging based on the plan, and that is one aspect. Another, even if we are engaging based on the plan and we see that it is not effective, then we look to making change in the plan so that it becomes effective. We'll adjust strategies and plans for engaging stakeholders. So if something doesn't work, we have to make changes and update our plan and keep on track the stakeholder plan. So the whole idea is to ensure that the plan is effective and we're moving according to the plan. And we'll evolve engagement approach as the project progresses. So and when we do that, we keep on optimizing based on our experience as we engage or converse or communicate with stakeholder more and more, we'll evolve that approach to make it more and more effective. Monitoring stakeholder engagements, basically there are a couple of things that we'll do. We'll conduct data analysis to really understand the position, and if there are some results that we're looking at, we have thought if we engage it this way and it is not working, then we analyze the data and see why it is not working out. And we will apply decision-making techniques. We have learned different decision-making techniques in identifying the best way to engage with stakeholders. So we might look through voting, some other decision-making techniques to see what is the best way to engage with the stakeholder, and we'll continually employ feedback and presentations to monitor stakeholder engagements. So essentially, when we are monitoring, one is we'll do data analysis to find out if something is not working out, why it is not working out, and then we will talk to our team and we'll do different decision-making techniques to see how we can best engage if it is not working out. And then also we ensure that there is a lot of feedback coming out from the stakeholder so that we can keep our engagement on track. So with this, we have finished this particular knowledge area, and we have in fact essentially uh, finished all the knowledge areas, processed all the knowledge areas, and we'll have one more session tomorrow, which will be the final wrap up, where we'll talk about ethics, because ethics is an important part in the PMP exam or the PMP curriculum. Uh, PMP curriculum. And I'll also give you some exam tips, how you should be thinking about exams, or how you should be thinking about questions when you are appearing for exam. So with this, we finish here for today, and I'll see you at the same time tomorrow.